All right. Hello, art lovers. This is Gordy Grundy with ArtReportToday.com, your worldwide arts news platform. Along with the great Doppelhaus Press, we would like to welcome you to what I anticipate will be a truly fantastical discussion. I have that very young feeling of excitement as if I were about to enter a circus tent, one that promises a world of wonders. Now, in our previous videos, we have examined the intrigue, depth, and drama of fictive art, a medium of creative deception. Today, I believe we will look at the fantasy and the whimsy. Now, if any of you have a question for our speakers, please feel free to send us a chat message, and we will answer those questions after the presentation. To all of our guests, please mute yourself. It's that little microphone symbol under your screen. Please click that to turn it red. Our host today is Professor Antoinette LaFarge, an artist and writer with a special interest in speculative fiction and alternative histories. Today we are here to discuss her new book, Sting in the Tail, Art, Hoax, and Provocation. Her many essays have been published internationally. Antoinette is the author of the book about an incredible feminist of the last century titled Louise Brigham and the Early History of Sustainable Furniture Design. Antoinette is a professor of new media art at UC Irvine. Today, the author will be speaking with our guest, artist Beauvais Lyons, who is featured in the book. Beauvais is the Chancellor's Professor at the University of Tennessee, where he's taught printmaking since 1985. Some of you may know him as the director of the fictional Hokes Archives, which focuses on exploring invented ancient civilizations. Others might recognize him as the creator of the Association for Creative Zoology, to highlight non-existent extinct species. And that's not all. Today we have a special guest, David Daly, the son of the late artist Norman Daly, who was a pioneer in the genre of mock archaeology and a major inspiration of Beauvais' work. Welcome, everyone. Professor LaFarge, the calliope is playing, the curtain is rising, and the center stage is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that very festive introduction, Gordy. Welcome, everybody, to today's talk with Beauvais Lyons and David Daly. As always with this series, I'm going to start with a very brief PowerPoint skimming over the surface of the two artists' oeuvres so that you can have some images in your heads and a little basic knowledge if you haven't gotten around to reading my rather large book while we go through the conversation that's going to ensue. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen with you all. And the first thing I want to talk about is the work of Norman Daly, who, as you see him here on the left, was an artist who's considered a pioneer of the genre of mock archaeology or fictive archaeology back in the 1960s and 1970s. His invented civilization of Luros, which you see on the map here on the right, was located in the Near East near the Iron Age kingdom of Lydia. So it's an ancient fictive civilization. This is one of the pieces, the many, many pieces and artifacts that Daly created for the civilization of Luros. This is a votive shrine. There's a lot of ceremonial objects, religious objects, as well as scientific games, scientific instruments and games, all of them supposedly made by the inhabitants of this civilization during its many eras. He mostly worked in painted wood and metal. He was a sculptor, and they often incorporated found materials, as you see here, these bits of metal, many of which suggested their origins in cast-off modern objects, lightly disguised, and so that hinted to some viewers that this wasn't quite what it seemed, even though it was always presented as a real ancient civilization with its artifacts. Norman Daly thought, he started to think about how it is that modern art always requires explanations. It's seldom something you can just look at and understand through seeing alone, and that made him consider that artists work today something like creative anthropologists, that the explanations are more anthropological than aesthetic often, and that led him to think about how an artist might function more broadly and as a creative anthropologist, and that, along with many other factors, led him to start creating this ancient civilization. On the left, you see some of the Larochian artifacts at the Istanbul Biennial in 2019. He worked with the composer Robert Moog to create Larochian music. He also wrote Larochian poems, songs, and other texts. It's a very all-encompassing kind of creativity, all focused on this civilization. On the right is a page from a catalog of one of Norman Daly's shows in 1972, and you can see how he didn't model it on an art catalog, which would have been a bit of a giveaway that it was an art project, but instead on the kind of catalog you might expect to see from an archaeological museum or collection, very dry, very staid in terms of descriptions, and very plain views of the artifacts. I'm going to turn now to Beauvais Lyons' work, which follows in several different ways from Norman Daly's work, and was in fact partly inspired by it. We're going to hear more about that later. Here we have an installation of Azudian temple objects, parts of the temple wall you can see back here, and then all the little vessels on the stands in the foreground. This is another Mark archaeological project. Beauvais has invented several different, also ancient Near Eastern civilizations, at least two others in addition to the Azudians. He works primarily in ceramics and printmaking, and in fact he is a master printmaker who specializes in lithography. And as Gordy said, many of the projects fall under the umbrella of the Hokes Archives, H-O-K-E-S, but it sounds exactly like H-O-A-X. So again, there are clues that this work is not exactly what it seems. On the left is a ceramic artifact, and on the right a mosaic fragment that Lyons created for the Azudian civilization. One of the things I want to draw attention to is the way in which the fragmented nature of the mosaic at the right draws on viewer expectations to make it seem more real. People have been to archaeological museums. They expect to see things that come out of excavations in fragments that never get pieced together. The paint is often faded and chipped and so on, wear and tear for thousands of years. And by creating the works in this model, not complete as if they had been made 2,000 years, but as if they had in fact survived 2,000 years of weathering, it makes the viewer more in tune with the idea that this is all real ancient artifacts. Here are a couple of Beauvais' lithographs, Azudian divination beads on the left and fragments of ancient stone monuments on the right. Here he's drawing on the style of 19th century scientific illustrations to further underline the realness of these inventions and the idea that they have been scientifically excavated and classified by experts, and that a great deal of invisible work by invisible experts has gone into securing the factuality of these completely made-up objects. In both of them, also, if you look at the objects themselves, we can see how his particular form of inventiveness often tends towards the witty and the surreal. One of my favorite set of objects in one of his lithographs, that's actually in my book, is a series of vessels that would be very hard to use to store any kind of liquid or safely pour at that kind of liquid. They're fantastically broken or deformed vessels, and they're really quite marvelous. In another one of his projects, Beauvais made this centaur skeleton. He actually made this in tandem with somebody else. I'm going to let him talk about that a little bit later because it's a very interesting story. So I'm going to skim over it right now, but I wanted you to have this image in your minds when we get to talking about it later. The centaur skeleton from Volos. He has done fictive art in a number of different genres, and one of them, as Gordy touched on, is in the area of mock zoology, and specifically through the Association for Creative Zoology, where through which he creates new fauna through a method that he calls zoomorphic juncture, which is essentially a fancy term for pasting the top half of one animal on the bottom half of another. More familiar animals combined intelligently and creatively to make these new creatures, which he then brings to us primarily in these lithographs, which again draw on older forms of printmaking to make us feel that they have been part of the culture for quite a long time. Another thing he does with the Association for Creative Zoology is to set up these kiosks housing the lithographs and also sometimes taxidermied invented fauna in order to engage the public in discussions of the flaws in creationist thinking and so-called intelligent design. And the playful and really appealingly in almost nonsensical nature of the invented creatures really lowers audience resistance to having these kinds of conversations about the very difficult, or what is for many people the very difficult subject of evolution. So he's explored, as I said, a whole bunch of different areas, which I don't have time to touch on today, but I do encourage you to go look up his work. He has a lovely website. Medical dissections, very unusual forms of medical dissection form part of one of his series, the Hoax Medical Arts on the Left. He has invented an entire collection of fictive folk art, the Spelvin collection, and most recently, which I'm hoping he'll tell us more about later on, he's been working on a fictive traveling circus from the 1920s. So I want to turn now to the actual conversation with our guests, and I want to begin with David Daly. I'm extremely happy to have Norman's son with us today, since Norman cannot be with us, having passed on some years ago. David, I would love to hear what it was like for you to grow up with someone who was inventing an ancient civilization from scratch. And did your father talk to you about it? Did he rope you in on it? What was it like?
Well, it's wonderful to be here and to be asked questions. My father worked on Loros when I was in college, and I was not in Ithaca for college or graduate school, and so I was not very close to the project itself. But I was certainly aware, going back to when I was in high school in the late 50s and early 60s, that my father was moving away from what had been his certainly his chosen approach to art making, which was painting, and had a modestly successful professional career as a painter alongside his teaching career. Something happened, and I don't know what it was, but by the late 50s, painting didn't draw him the way it used to, and he started to move out into an additional dimension. Very first example of that was he got to know a local tombstone carver and learned sandblasting techniques He had no formal training in sculpture of any sort, but he learned to do that, and he produced probably about a dozen marble plaques. I think that's the term he used, it's the term I use, that were in effect bas reliefs, but of course they were incised by the sandblasting technique, leaving images of the original flat surface of marble. Then, now that three dimensions were part of the picture, he moved into found objects and working in assemblage. But this was in the, I would say, the early 60s. And I was aware of both of these new ventures of his because I witnessed them and certainly had some sense of his enthusiasm. He continued to paint for a while, but his interest, that was not his focus anymore. I wasn't aware, certainly in the mid-60s, which as best I can reconstruct, that was when he first had the idea of doing a broader project. He did like the word project and used it a lot. Recently I found reference to what was apparently the very first version in terms of name of Luros, the word Luria, L-L-H-U-R-I-A. And somehow or other that got dropped and Luros became the chosen name for the whole project and for everything that it came to embody. So he continued to experiment and venture ever more into three dimensions. So Luros, when ultimately exhibited in the early 70s initially, was really a three-dimensional project. It was a sculptural project as I see it. He did bring in a few two-dimensional works that were kind of somewhat reconfigured paintings. I think one was on board, maybe both were on board, but everything else was three-dimensional. And that's where his imagination really began to expand and flourish.
Do you know if he saw himself as at all an outsider in the art world? Because he was doing a kind of work that didn't really have a name and wasn't at all aligned with the main art movements of the 1960s and 1970s.
I don't think he saw himself as an outsider, but he certainly recognized that he was doing something new. And in fact, at one point, I can't really date it, but it probably was around 1968, he came up with the idea for a new course to be offered to the art students at Cornell, which he called mixed media. And so he identified his own work by that point as being in the field, if we can call it a field, of mixed media. That's the way I think of it as well, because there was nothing there was no electronic component other than the sound, but there was no more central electronic element in the presentation of Luros. So I think he saw himself as doing something new, something that I think he recognized his own imagination could exercise itself in, if that's the way to put it, but also because he was formally trained. He was born in 1911, and his training was in the mid to late 30s. And it was an entirely formal academic BFA and MFA, and it included a year of studying in Paris in 1937-38. His experience of both traditional materials and traditional formal values was extremely strong. And one of the things that I, in recent years, have come to recognize in Luros, the whole project, is that each individual object has its own, what I think of as aesthetic identity that relates directly back to his experience and valuation of formal values and traditional materials.
Yes, I do see a very strong formal quality in the work, without any question. But I'm interested in the fact that he was sort of working out there by himself. And I want to now throw this open to Beauvais, who's comes along a bit later. And I'm curious how you discovered Norman's work and became interested in mock archaeology yourself.
Thanks, Antoinette, and hello, David and Antoinette. It's great to be with you this evening. So I had been pursuing mock archaeological work before I knew about Norman's work, but Rudy Turk, who was the director of the Art Museum at Arizona State University when I was in graduate school, said after a studio visit, you need to contact Norman Daly and learn about his work. So that was in 1981 was when I first wrote to Norman. I, at that point, had been pursuing mock archaeology for my undergraduate thesis and then my graduate thesis. But really the context that led me to the medium was that as a child, I developed an interest in ancient cultures because I spent 3 years in the Middle East. My father was an English professor at the University of Wisconsin. He had Fulbrights at Baghdad University in '64 and Tehran University in the early '70s. And that gave me a chance to go to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and Persepolis and so forth. I first encountered the term mock archaeology in Edward Lucy Smith's book, Art of the '70s, in which he depicted several artists investigating archaeological themes like Charles Simmons. But it was an exhibit at the Kohler Art Center in 1979 called Civilizations, Ruth Kohler put together. And there were a lot of artists working in ceramics who were exploring ideas of invented cultures. And one of them was Clayton Bailey, who created Bigfoot finds. You know, he was teaching at Cal State Hayward at the time. There were other artists like Robert Arneson, Art Morrison, and so forth. And I came to all of that from a background in ceramics. I had studied ceramics in a Bauhaus tradition at a school in northeastern Iowa. Dean Schwartz, who taught at Luther College for many years, had this school. And in high school, I learned ceramic pottery. And much of that work was informed by looking at ancient Greek ceramics and pre-Columbian ceramics. And so when I went to college, initially at Alfred University and then the University of Wisconsin, I became really involved in printmaking. And I saw connections then between the possibility of working in ceramics and documenting those ceramics using traditional printmaking methods, thinking about artists like Piranesi or David Roberts' views of Palestine. And so really the kinds of things I was able to do with mock archaeology grew out of my liberal arts education. You know, it seemed like the best way for me to use all the things that my education had provided me, an interest in cultural anthropology. My father had directed me to Borges and Tulun Ukbar Orbis Tertius. So I have so many privileges as a person, my experience growing up, my educational opportunities. And it seemed as if a lot of efforts were made to kind of specialize, you know. And to me, mock archaeology provided a way to kind of build all these things together: ceramics, photography, printmaking, public speaking, kind of, and all of it with a kind of late '70s question authority ethos. So that's the nutshell of where all those ingredients came together to form the work.
You know, as an aside, I have to say that a remarkable number of fictive artists I've talked to were inspired, including myself, by the Borges story, Tulun Ukbar Orbis Tertius. I recommend it to anybody who's at all interested in this genre. It's a wonderful story. But I'm thinking about archaeology, and there's a very long period of human past history and prehistory that could be plundered for or a sort of, that's probably too violent a word, be chosen as a place to deploy an artwork like this. What is it about the ancient Near East that drew you for your projects?
Well, obviously, it was some level of familiarity. The Arnat were in north central Turkey, the Apasht were in the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan, and the Azudians were along the Euphrates River. I think part of it is questions about this period as human history moved from Paleolithic to Neolithic cultures, the early cities. I think there's a great deal. I mean, what's interesting about the graphic history of printmaking and lithography is the way it coincides with those great excavations of the late 19th century, Sir Austin Henry Layard and others. To me, it was the richness of material, but also the unanswered questions, the ambiguity. So it just seems ripe for that kind of thing. But a lot of it was ceramics and printmaking lent themselves to explorations in that part of the world.
That makes sense, and certainly I touched very briefly on the fact that fragmentation means you can leave a lot of things out that might be awkward to try to figure out for your project. People expect lacuna and imperfection. So that might be seen as an advantage of mark archaeology as a genre. What are some of the challenges of working in a civilization that's 2,000 years, 3,000 years before our own, as an artist, a creative artist?
Well, I think there's, those challenges, there's inherent challenges to making any kind of visual art statement. I think in inventing a culture, part of what you're looking for as an artist is what are the rules, and there are rules that are there. They're always self-imposed rules. And so the most fascinating challenge is determining, what's your general vision of that culture is. What is their creation myth? So in the case of the Apasht, I focused on what that was. What sort of culture do you envision? And then I think the real challenge is to look at the ancient material closely enough to develop an appreciation for aspects of it, but then to set it aside, because otherwise you're just going to parrot it. So you want to make it look authentic. And sometimes that comes from the nature of the materials you're using, because they have that built-in aura of historical sort of qualities of authenticity and value. But so it's kind of a dance with a priori planning, but also just listening to a kind of subconscious and seeing where the project takes you. It's almost as if you're excavating something as you do it. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, one of the things I find myself thinking about for both Norman's work and yours is how you work in media besides the visual or the tactile. Norman wrote all those poems and texts, and including sort of satirical texts that satirized academic prose while drawing on this idea of the expert. And you use printmaking similarly, and also write articles about your work. So I'm interested in how you see printmaking and article writing, essay writing, as part of this constellation. Do you see them as sort of a supportive exterior part of the project, or are they part of is the core everything from the visual work to the academic work to the printmaking that draws so carefully on even the fonts that were used 100 years ago?
Sure. Yeah, I remember in graduate school, I made the mistake of using Helvetica for something that was from the late 19th century. And my professor said, you have to go back and redesign that, because that was designed in the 1950s, right?
Yeah.